Hello, my dearest friends. It's me, Joe Pasevich. Welcome back to Control Room here from the Marshfield Community Media Studios at the high school in beautiful Marshfield. It is Wednesday, March the 4th, and right now it's a nice spring day outside. We're looking at about 3 or 4 days of unsettled weather with rain coming off and on throughout the period, but now it looks like next week is going to be well into the 50s, and we're only 2 weeks away from springtime, from the vernal equinox. So here we go. We're on our way. It looks good. A little bit of bad news is that the Marshfield High basketball team lost last night. They were in a group of 16 in the MIAA finals playoffs, and they were defeated by Andover. I went up to the game. It took me over 3 hours to get there because they were hit by a big thump of snow on the North Shore. We got a bit of snow down here too, but they really got hit hard up there. And in fact, the whole team and a lot of the entourage from Marshfield, which was sizable, and I congratulate you all for making the trek, got there. They were delayed getting there, so they had to delay the start of the game. And I didn't get home last night until almost midnight, but they went down in defeat. You can talk about analysis of the game on other sites, but here we're getting into the political season, as you know. It's getting very, very busy, and town meeting is scheduled this year for Monday, April 27th. That is not that far away. Okay, this is March. That is April, all right? So you're looking at, what, 7 weeks away? Also, town elections will be coming up on that following Saturday, and there are very few people that have actually taken out nomination papers for the various offices. I think one person took out two people taking out nomination papers for the select board, and I'm not aware of any other papers being taken out. So if you want to run for something, even for the fun, or if you're a glutton for punishment like me, you will do that, all right? And what it does is it sort of sparks debate and discussion, and we need more of that. It's very inexpensive for you to come here and join me here on Control Room, or to come to any meeting and hobnob and learn about what's happening in town. It doesn't really cost you anything. If you want to get more deeply involved, here's an example. I got an email from the Mass GOP, and it said here, we are rescheduling our Mass GOP gubernatorial luncheon. I said, oh, but I'm pleased to share that the event is now back on. We would like you to join us. Oh, yeah, I'm interested in GOP politics and who's running for governor. Oh, but if I want to attend, I have to pledge $1,000 to the party. So I don't think I'll be there, folks. Sorry, you'll have to carry on without me. The big event that has happened, oh, one other thing I got to talk about, is that in the wake of the storm last week, as you know, I am a housing commissioner. I'm on the board of the Marshfield Housing Authority. And as a housing commissioner, I have a great deal of concern of how the facilities and the properties that we manage are taken care of. And so after the storm, I took a ride just to drive around to see if all the lights were on, that kind of thing, at a couple of our facilities. One is known as T-Rock, and the other one's known as Grace Ryder. Grace Ryder, as you know, is the old Grace Ryder School building, you know, over there across from the fairgrounds on Main Street. And I had talked to some people, and I found out that basically everything was going okay, that the power had gone off briefly over at T-Rock, but a generator kicked in, and then the main source of power was restored. Everything looked like it was in order. The lights were on down there at the time I was there. But I was a little uncertain about what I was hearing about some of the other locations. And so I drove over to the Grace Ryder building to see if the lights are on, and I saw some people standing around and asked them how it's going. And what I found out, to make a long story short, was that there was no heat in the building, that somehow some lights and electrical outlets were working, and there were attempts to use the electrical outlets to run space heaters to make up for the lack of central heat, and the residents wanted me to help them flip the breakers to keep the breakers from flipping every time they overloaded the circuits with space heaters. I made some inquiries about if that was proper with the town, and what happened was an inspection was conducted almost immediately involving town officials. And I did find a follow-up email to me indicated that multiple violations and a fire hazard was determined to exist at that facility. Now, I followed up by sending an email to the manager, the executive director that manages the Housing Authority property, hired by the Housing Authority, an executive director that works for the Quincy Housing Authority, and I sent the same email to the chair of the Marshfield Housing Authority Commissioners Board of Commissioners. And basically I got an email saying, to ease your concerns, everything's been handled properly. That's it. And I had written in my email, I want to know what happened. How was the storm handled? So now there's an email circulating apparently that says, yes, there's fire hazards and other violations found at the Grace Ryder facility. And I'm trying to follow up. And I would bet you dollars to donuts that, they're probably going to impeach me again because I'm concerned. Just to let you know. And I'm saying all this because people have been asking me, and people were just discussing the issue without me even being involved, because they had been hearing from relatives that they were freezing and cold and were experiencing problems over at the Grace Ryder facility. So I'm trying to do my job as a housing commissioner. And if you want to, again, run for an office or be involved, you've got, hopefully, a commitment to being involved, to taking your job seriously, all right? A lot of people take these positions, and it's, I don't know, I'm trying to figure out, is it some kind of a status thing? Is it something you put on your resume? So, folks, if you really do care, then try to get on a board or committee and even try to run for something, because the number one qualification is that you give a crap about what's going on and where your money's being spent. And with regards to that, there was a joint select board and advisory board meeting at the town hall last night, and wherein they discussed the budget for the upcoming, to be voted on the upcoming town meeting. We are over a month behind in having that information available to us, all right? At the same time, like other things, seem to be like way behind schedule, or I suspect being slow walked, okay? And maybe people want somebody new to get on the select board before we hire another administrator. I don't know what the motives are. You can only speculate, all right? So keep abreast of what's happening there. We'll be talking more about it now. The biggest news really is related to the fact that, as you know, MBTA zoning is very controversial. We shot it down twice at town meeting because the law that started MBTA zoning says that a town must set up a district for MBTA zoning. That is basically a high density, high occupancy apartment block. In our case, we were assessed that we needed over 1,000 apartment units to be established somewhere town in a reasonably sized district. That's what the statute says. It also says in the overall law that encompasses, that is built, that this law is, this MBTA zoning is a part of, is that town meeting gets to vote on adopting the zoning, whether to adopt it or not. And that's been long standing. And so part of our argument is that we voted down MBTA zoning. We don't want it. We have a right to do that. That's what the law specifies as the process for adopting any kind of zoning, including MBTA zoning. So, under pressure from the residents, even though the town on the third push by the planning board and other insiders did get MBTA zonings passed and adopted in Marshfield, under pressure from the residents, a lawsuit was initiated with the town council, Bob Galvin, at the lead in Plymouth Superior Court, and then to the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts. And the Supreme Judicial Court challenging the MBTA zoning law as an unfunded mandate and as basically violating the voters' rights, disenfranchising the voters by not allowing them to follow the law and go to town meeting and then choose how to vote, yes or no. So they're disenfranchising the voters by taking that away. And so it went to the Supreme Judicial Court, and here's one thing that was not so encouraging that came out of it at the very end of the oral arguments. And it's,
Would the court like to hear argument on the second, on the town meeting voting rights argument? We believe that to the extent that's a constitutional claim, the town does not have standing to bring it. To the extent that it's a claim under Section 40A, or General Laws 40A, Section 5, we just have two statutes that don't conflict with each other, and they should be read harmoniously to give full effect to each of them.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
so what the attorney for the state was saying, that the case being heard before the Supreme Judicial Court contained two major elements. One was the issue of an unfunded mandate, and under state law, you cannot have unfunded mandates. The state cannot be telling cities and towns to do things that aren't then going to be funded, for which there is no funding. And the second major issue was, again, as I just described, were the voters disenfranchised? Bob Galvin was given 15 minutes before the judges, and then the state's attorney was given 15 minutes before the judges. And we're going to start running through that, but I want to say that almost everything was all about the unfunded mandate. You're going to hear now shortly, this was all about the unfunded mandate. And the issue of the disenfranchisement of the voters was characterized by this state's attorney as being a constitutional issue that the town has no standing for. And what that makes me think is that the state is saying that the voters are disenfranchised and the town, as the plaintiff, does not have standing, which makes me think that maybe the voters would have standing in a court case, and we may have to maybe get together as residents in Marshfield and in other towns and enter a lawsuit in order to get this back up to the Supreme Judicial Court, this issue to be dealt with. But now I'm going to go to the overall court case, and we're going to try to run through it as quickly as we can. Here's the cover sheet of the brief that was filed by the town of Marshfield by Bob Galvin related to this case. And it's got a very large table, index of, table of contents. And you can see that the first, one of the first issues was the town meeting voters have the constitutional right to vote yes or no. There's an argument related to the home rule law in Massachusetts, and also the issue of the unfunded mandates. And this is an appeal because the Superior Court here in Plymouth dismissed this case. This is a case that's now on appeal to the Supreme Judicial Court. Let's see how much of this we can get through.
13840, Town of Marshfield versus Commonwealth of Massachusetts et al. Attorney Galvin.
So there's the introduction.
Good morning, Your Honors. May it please the Court. Attorney Robert Galvin, representing the town of Marshfield. Your Honors, this is a case, the effect of which was to compel the town of Marshfield's legislative body, the town meeting, to adopt a multifamily housing district where there are no discretionary approvals permitted. This is an area that has traditionally been reserved zoning for municipalities. The impact of the MBTA communities law was to cause the town to bear some extraordinary expense in order to comply with 22 pages of regulations, which were formerly guidelines previously stricken by the court, and to bear the ultimate expense.
What were the expenses?
Now there you go. This is what an unfunded mandate issue has to deal with. You have to actually show what the funds are that are necessary to initiate or to implement a law or a directive or whatever you want to call it in the state of Massachusetts. And right off the bat, the first justice to ask questions goes right to Bob Galvin and says, okay, well, what are those costs? Bob Galvin, the attorney, says, well, we have all these extraordinary costs, et cetera, et cetera. And that's true. We did have costs. We had to put town staff on the job of finding a place, because the law says find a district of reasonable size. So now you've got to find a district of reasonable size that will hold over 1,000 units of apartments, okay? Now you can't just put that, you can't just take a map and draw a box anywhere, because putting a box that's a special zone, like an MBTA zone, you can't put it on stuff where there's already critical infrastructure. We don't want to put it on top of the sewer plant. We don't want to put it on top of the high school. You want to look ahead to what the impacts are on the local economy. And in fact, in the MBTA Communities Act, Section 3A of Chapter 40A, it actually says there are places where you can't put these things, like environmentally sensitive areas, okay? So right off the bat, the SJC justices are keying in on what is the actual cost that you're claiming you're incurring.
The expenses for the town of Marshfield?
Yeah, and how were they necessary?
Your Honor, there were 22 pages of guidelines promulgated.
Yeah, but what were the Marshfield expenses? I know the guidelines exist.
Marshfield was forced to employ a person to develop modeling. We had no experience applying the compliance regulations, and we had to incur expense associated with that. We had a series of interactions with the Housing and Livable Communities where we developed various types of models, had to exclude areas of the town where this was even permitted because we had to develop a district of reasonable size, location, and density, had to test those models, frequently come back and forth, and then ultimately we developed a district that the planning board approved and was presented to town meeting.
Now, why were those, why did you have to develop modeling?
Because the regulations required us.
Modeling?
Correct. Your Honor.
Where do the regs require modeling?
We're waiting.
Sorry, Your
where are the
Honor, I
regs?
didn't have that off the top of my head, but
Okay,
Well,
what
you're
are
saying
they,
it's an
Bob?
unfunded mandate, and I'm wondering what the funds are that the town of Marshfield claims it was required to.
So you see, the judge is going kind of like a two-pronged probe here. She wants to know the dollars and cents amount that's being talked about. And now she's going off on what do the regulations that implement MBTA zoning actually require. So she's going at two prongs. That's not fair. That's bad on her.
Expend in order to comply with the statute that just requires one district of reasonable size in which multifamily housing is permitted as of right.
I think
Yes, more specifically, the attorney.
And she's got to understand it's one district, right, of reasonable size. But again, you don't just draw a box on a map, all right? There's some element of like care that has to be taken, even if you're going to try to comply or meaningfully apply the law.
General has said that this could have been complied with by one sentence. Why is that not? What's your response to that?
Well, Your Honor, I disagree that that's what the law required. The law actually required the development of a district of reasonable size.
So the justice is saying that the Attorney General stated that, if I understood her correctly, that law could be complied with one sentence. In other words, put one sentence into your zoning bylaw that says the town can build multifamily, high-density apartment blocks up to 6 stories high in the town, end of story. That's what the justice, is that the justice's understanding of the MBTA zoning law? That's very bad. That's pitiful if that's what she thinks. And if she's going to swallow that argument from the Attorney General, Andrea Campbell, I believe that she's referring to, if she's going to swallow that argument, wow, we are in deep trouble. And you wouldn't just put one sentence in it, because then you could have what some scaremongers have been saying, like a 6-story building down on Wrexham Beach or something like that. And that's the justice's understanding? Boy, that's really troubling.
And that district had to meet certain requirements, both guidelines and then regulations. It didn't require the town to adopt a blanket adoption of multifamily housing in any district. It directed us to develop a
But
district.
couldn't the town of Marshfield have complied by simply allowing multifamily housing in all of its districts?
I think it could have done that, Your Honor.
It could not have done?
It could have done that,
It
yes.
could have done that. So what's the expense of that one sentence in allowing?
Did you hear the justice say it should have done that? That's what the judge just said. The judge says it should have done that. Is she a judge, or is she on Maura Healey's new green, high density, destroy the suburbs agenda? It should have done that? Really, Judge? She shouldn't be. She should be disqualified.
All districts in Marshfield to have multifamily housing.
I would think that that expense would be fairly nominal if we adopted simply what the Attorney General was suggesting, Your Honor.
Why would that not, why wouldn't that, doesn't that vitiate your case that this is an unfunded mandate? What, can you just sort of explain
Your
how
Honor.
the case goes on?
In my view, the statute required not that the town allow multifamily anywhere. And if
Well, I know that that's not what the statute requires. It's how you could have complied, or your client could have complied with the statute.
Well, Your Honor, I certainly disagree with.
So here's the judge basically saying the most important thing is that you comply. Comply! Comply! I'm the government. Comply!
Your Honor, the statute mandated that the town develop a zoning district of reasonable size with certain density, and that was the mandate that we received, and that was the mandate that we required. If the state had merely incorporated this into Section 3 and made it a subject that we couldn't regulate, or regulate subject to, or say no discretionary approval subject to reasonable regulations, they could have done that and made it very simple for the town of Marshfield, but they didn't, Your Honor.
And you see, that's what Chapter 40B does. It doesn't have a section that says the town meeting must vote to adopt 40B. It just says when a 40B developer proponent comes to your town, you've got to hear the case, and you've got to allow certain allowances for the construction of a 40B in any type of zone, like commercial, residential, or industrial even, okay? MBTA zoning has restrictions on it. You can't, well, even 40B would have restrictions on it, where you can't put it in an environmentally sensitive area. So this judge is off, I don't know where she's coming from. She doesn't understand, apparently doesn't understand the basic issue. And Bob Galvin is having all of his time wasted by having to deal with a very basic question. What is MBTA zoning, and what does the actual act say? Didn't she read that?
No, I guess I mean, maybe it's just convenient for you to change the question, but the question is not whether the statute mandated that the town of.
She's changing the question. Like I said, she developed a two-prong approach on actual costs and actually on the adoption and implementation mechanism.
Marshfield have multi-family housing in all of its districts. My question was really, why couldn't you have complied with the statute that requires one district of reasonable size by allowing multifamily housing in every district?
I think I tried to answer that directly, Your Honor, and I think that the answer is the town could have done that.
Okay.
And our cases say that forcing you to make difficult choices is not a mandate, right?
I agree, Your Honor, but those.
So that's where I lose you. I mean, I understand modeling may have been expensive, but you made a choice to sort of try to accomplish the statute that way as opposed to another. And that seems to fall within our case law, that it's not a mandate.
I disagree, Your Honor. I do think that the statute did not direct us to just allow multifamily housing in any district. It directed us to comply, to develop a district of reasonable size with density, location requirements, and a whole series of guidelines that I've never seen required.
So that judge basically is saying you can't even consider what the funding obligations and expenses to the town are. That's what he's saying. So he's kind of taking out the state law on unfunded mandates and tossing that aside. Unbelievable. What a
in connection with the adoption of any zoning bylaw before. This is very unique, and that's what caused the expense to the town of Marshfield. Now, was that an expense that?
It just seems like it fits within a classic incidental expense, and the fact that it was more expensive was a choice you made.
Your Honor, I disagree, Your Honor. In order to comply with these guidelines and now regulations, which is what the mandate was, Certainly, there was expense involved, and I disagree that this falls within the case law that says that this was a tough choice that we had to make. I don't think that that was in any way, shape, or form. What the planner did in Marshfield, Your Honor, is to try to find an area where we could actually accommodate this use. It's been argued by the Attorney General in this case that we were doing something bespoke or something of that nature. Your Honor, Marshfield is a rural town, relatively speaking. We're not the smallest town, but we're not the largest town either. And there's a whole series of places in the town of Marshfield where it would not even be physically possible to locate a development like this, a multifamily development. It just wouldn't work. The roads are not sufficient to handle this. What the planner did is spent extraordinary time and expense trying to model a place where a location like this would work, and there would be the least expense to the town of Marshfield.
There was a planner on staff, or?
We have a planner on staff, and we hired an additional planner, Your Honor.
Isn't that, again, like the follow-up to the bus case that we decided, the old case that described
Kennedy versus
leaving it as a choice?
with a Lexington case, Your Honor, I believe Lexington 2, where they provide busing for private school students, where the town had already agreed to provide busing. I thought that was more of an effort to clarify existing law, Your Honor, and the town had voluntarily chosen to do this already. This in no way, shape, or form was something that the town of Marshfield chose in any way. This was something that we were ordered to do.
So do you hear the justice basically saying Marshfield chose a more expensive way to try to cite this MBTA zoning area? So that's on you. You gotta eat that. That's basically what the judge seems to be saying to me, right? Doesn't it seem that way? When you have 1,000 apartments with who knows how many people, where do you want to put them? I mean, the MBTA zoning law says that these project areas should be within a half a mile of MBTA service. Where are we going to put it? Down out, like I said, in Ocean Bluff or something, even further away from the station up at up in Situate, right? It makes no sense. It already makes no sense that even to put it on Plain Street or near 3A, which is Main Street, the route to Situate, even that doesn't make sense. And these justices it's like they don't understand, they haven't read the MBTA law.
We're here on an appeal from a decision on a motion to dismiss, correct? So to my mind, at least, that means that we're really looking at the allegations of the complaint. So to follow up on the question of like the expenses or costs incurred by Marshfield, can you point me to the specific paragraphs of your complaint that contain any of these explanations of costs and expenses you've just outlined here during oral argument?
Your Honor, I did concede that we didn't detail every cost and expense.
I'm just looking for any, what are the paragraphs of your
Paragraph
complaint?
52, Your Honor.
Let's
Of
look
the
at
complaint. We also incorporated by reference the Division of Local States decisions.
52 says the Marshfield parties expect to incur additional costs as the direct result of the mandatory
I
requirements.
believe if you look at the prior paragraph, Your Honor, have already.
51 says they have incurred costs and expenses in evaluating and drafting proposed zoning laws.
Yes, Your Honor.
That's what you're relying on?
Well, that and the prior incorporation of the Division of Local, the local mandate determinations by the Office of the Inspector
What
General.
do we do with the judge's conclusion that these don't meet a sufficient pleading standard?
Well, Your Honor, I disagree with that.
I know, but
These allegations are true, and the reasonable inferences that we made, and you remember the record also included Mr. Gieman's affidavit because the motions to dismiss and motions for preliminary injunction were held at the same time. And we explained how there were technical expenses and hundreds of hours that were developed in creating this bylaw and the tasks that were involved.
Can I follow up with Justice Wolahojan's question? But the problem, I guess, in the framework that we're here on a motion to dismiss is the statute itself requires direct compulsory non-incidental obligations, right? So if you just have in your complaint these generalized allegations of additional administrative burdens or the cost that went into kind of local law making, and that paragraph that was just read talks about some speculative, maybe downstream costs. How does that fit within the Rule 12 standard? Because that's the part that I think we're going to have to grapple with, is where's the specificity that you're claiming is tied to the extra that the statute requires?
Your Honor, we argued to the Superior Court at the time the motion to dismiss that the pleadings were sufficient because we alleged direct service and cost obligations. And we supplemented that with our briefing where we explained, and I attached Mr. Gieman's affidavit that explained that these were technical expenses outside. So the briefing, in my view, explained why the reasonable inferences should have been granted in favor of the town.
But reasonable inferences are based on facts, right? So are there facts that say line item by line item that we can point to and say, these are the direct consequential costs of having to comply that are outside of the local stuff that we have to do in any event?
We did not detail those expenses.
That's what I'm getting at. So you're asking us to rely on reasonable inferences, but you've tried a lot of cases, and you know that the standard jury instruction for reasonable inferences is they're based on facts that have been proved to you.
Yes.
So we need those facts, don't we? Don't we need?
So here's where Bob Galvin, the town's lawyer, seems to be getting in a little trouble. They cite an actual rule, a court rule, in other words, a procedural rule, 12A. They're saying you didn't give us, it sounds to me like they're saying, because I'm not an attorney, I play one sometimes, that you didn't actually give us a list of what you spent dealing with MBTA zoning. You talked about you had spent money and you're anticipating spending more money, and that's what 99% of the people I talked to in town were worried about, was the impact on the schools, on the roads, on fire and police, water, sewer services, trash services. What is going to be the cost to the town? And when the state's attorney starts talking about this, you're going to have your mind blown. Wait till you hear what the state's attorney says about the town absorbing those kinds of costs. But this is where Bob seems to have a weak part of his case, where he didn't actually document or enumerate, various costs and expenditures.
The index facts?
Yes, Your Honor. And what I have suggested to you is that we incorporated the claims and the findings from the Division of Local Mandates, which said that these were more than incidental expenses, incorporated them by reference into the complaint.
That's Diana DiZoglio's paper.
Then we argued that the reasonable inferences were that these were more than incidental expenses, and we supplemented that with the affidavit by Mr. Gaiman.
But the opinion that you're relying on doesn't relate to the town of Marshfield.
There was a case, Your Honor, and that I cited in my brief where
I'm talking
I believe
about
it was
the
a products
analysis by the state auditor's division. That
You see, DiZoglio's opinion on unfunded mandates wasn't an actual review of what Marshfield was spending to deal with MBTA zoning. That's where she's coming from.
is that the part? Is that the opinion that you're saying was incorporated by reference?
Yes, the
Okay, but-
law from that case, Your Honor, the law from the decisions in the Methuen case and in the Middleborough case and the Wenham case is what I incorporated by reference. And in those three determinations, which Marshfield subsequently obtained one, but it was after the record was closed and after the decision was made, but it had the similar language, all said that these were more than incidental expenses that were incorporated. So that is an inference that we asked the Superior Court judge to draw in our favor. And the crux of our unfunded mandate claim at this particular stage is that we never got an opportunity to try to explain these expenses. And because we were deprived of that ability to explain those expenses, we were not able to. The Superior Court judge was wrong in drawing.
You could have amended your complaint, but you didn't.
We did not amend our complaint, Your Honor.
Right. I mean, this is the basic problem. You're facing a motion to dismiss. The normal solution is not to try to get in things that are outside pleading, but to look at a motion to dismiss in reference to the face of the pleading, or to seek to amend the pleading to specify exactly what you're relying on in terms of factual allegations. I don't know about this process that you're proposing, which is to look at anything that's said in a brief or something that's attached to a brief. What rule of civil procedure covers that?
Well, Your Honor, there is a rule that allows you to look when you're dealing with a motion to dismiss with other information in the record and beyond the four corners of the complaint, and that's...
It's a very limited rule.
I agree, Your Honor, but in the complaint, we referenced the opinions that were issued by the Division of Local Mandates in which these findings were made. And I think that that's more than sufficient at this stage where all of the inferences have to be drawn in our favor and not in favor of the Commonwealth to get past this burden.
I'm just trying to figure out, how do we take the fact, okay, there are other towns, Middleborough, you say, and 2 other towns. How do we know that their expenses are the same as yours? How do we make that jump? Not sure I follow that.
I'm not sure. I think every circumstance in every town has to be looked at it differently.
But then don't you lose? That's because
No, Your Honor.
If there's nothing in yours that defines what you did, and you're relying on the division of whatever it is, which is interpreting 3 different towns, I just don't see how you can bootstrap that.
Well, Your Honor, again, we were incorporating the fact that there had been a determination by another state agency.
But about different towns and different expenses.
Right, but that's what actually opened the door for us to file the petition. Once there'd been a determination in any community that the law was an unfunded mandate, and that's what the determination was by the Division of Local Mandates.
So basically what Bob Galvin is saying is that for some towns it may be an unfunded mandate, for some other towns it may be not so much unfunded, and for other towns it may be a really unfunded mandate. And to me that's an issue, and maybe it's a constitutional issue, but that's an issue.
Marshfield then decided to bring the unfunded mandate claim. And
I get that triggered it, but don't you have to allege your own specifics?
well, yes, Your Honor, but again, in many cases, we allege a duty, we allege a breach, we allege proximate cause and actual cause, we allege damages, but it's rare that we would explain every single one of those elements in a complaint. There are certainly...
I don't know. I'm sure that's a good idea, but anyway, I won't debate that one.
No, I mean, we're not getting into every specific detail of all of those allegations, Your Honor, in the complaint, and that's the point that I was trying to make.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now here comes the attorney for the state,
Amy Carmel.
and I think she does more to advance Marshfield's case than
Morning, may it
you
please
might
the
be
court.
expecting.
Esme Caramello, on behalf of the Commonwealth, with me at council table is Jamie Hogue, Senior Counselor to the Attorney General. I'd like to start with what has been discussed this morning, although there are 2 claims here, and that's the local mandates law. The court has spent some time on the question of the pleading standard, and I'd like to address that. But I'd like to say at first that the question of whether a statute imposes an unfunded mandate is a question of law for the court. This court held that in Worcester, and it's our position that as a matter of law, the MBTA Communities Act does not impose anything beyond an incidental administration expense on Marshfield or any other community, and does not impose a direct cost obligation outside of that on any community. The law is a zoning requirement. It requires that the zoning codes in these communities have in them room for multifamily housing to be developed as of right. It sort of mandates a state of affairs.
But zoning is about creating a town that you want and anticipating and planning for the costs and benefits of whatever it is you're zoning for or anticipating. It's not just about putting words on paper. And that belies what's really going on here. The state wants total control of all zoning and land planning across the state, and they want to get their camel's nose under the tent or their foot in the door to establish a precedent for and through a court ruling from the SJC that they can tell any town what to do, and you've got to adopt that kind of zoning. This is what it all comes down to. This is your Andrea Campbell, the Attorney General, who's running for re-election this fall, and she has an opponent, okay, who's definitely against MBTA zoning and this kind of harassment and imposition upon the cities and towns.
To get to that state of affairs, some communities, including the community of Marshfield, need to take some action to reach the obligation, to meet the obligation. But that action is incidental to the primary obligation. The primary obligation is to have the zoning in place. So those costs, the costs of doing that, as has been
And why do we have to have the zoning in place? Come on, what's the agenda? Get to the agenda.
mentioned in the discussion this morning, are incidental administration costs.
I mean, to give them their argument, so they say, okay, the regulations are very detailed. We want this done properly. They're very controversial in each town because people don't want some of these things built next to their houses. So you do want it done right? And that's going to take, in these little towns, their zoning officer may not have the skill to do that, right?
I think those might be two different things. Certainly, doing it right, great idea.
Doing it right is a great idea. Wow, what a concession from your Attorney General's lawyer. Wow, let's do it right. Whatever it is we're trying to do.
Important, good idea. The question of whether,
Do it in a sophisticated way would be also a good idea.
well, it might be and it might not be. And I think that there might be two questions built into your question. One is, are the regulations so complicated that this is not the typical incidental administration expense? And I think the answer to that is no. Is it true that in some communities there is opposition to this law? Not all communities, but in some communities. And taking Marshfield at its word, that might be true in Marshfield, and might there be? So if I could address each of those.
There may not be opposition in some of those communities because they've done it so well, and they've hired experts and done it in a way that it costs a lot of money, but accomplishes the goal in a way that satisfies the town members too. Right?
Well, some communities that it may be, first of all, of course, and I know this isn't the record, but in some communities, it's because everybody recognizes we're in a housing crisis, and this is a good opportunity to take our zoning. It's transit oriented, it's family oriented.
There it is. She just spilled the beans. See, you people in Marshfield are too stupid to realize the housing crisis and what the governor and her team's solution is to it. Let's not talk about what the housing crisis is or how it got to be what it is or how costs got to be what it is. Let's not talk about the national debt, interest rates, okay, printing money, fiat money. Let's not talk about any of those things. Let's not talk about the mass exodus of voters and taxpayers from Massachusetts. No, let's just talk about an edict that you got to believe in and you got to go along with no matter what.
We don't have enough school children in our schools, and we need the enrollment. And so these are great opportunities in communities.
There it is. She said this is a great opportunity to increase school enrollment. She just, wow, that's what I was referring to at the start of the show. That'll blow your mind. They look at this kind of thing, MBTA housing, basically high density, unlimited capacity. Who knows how many students, which was what, like I said, 99% of the people are thinking about, what is this going to cost us in terms of the impacts on the town? Many years ago, I submitted an article to town meeting to change the town zoning that would require a proponent of a project to give us a calculation of the impacts on the town. It was defeated by like a handful of votes. There she goes. MBTA, the state is telling you MBTA zoning is a chance for a place like Marshfield to increase the enrollment in our schools. What else is there to be said?
Have leaned into those opportunities. But the reality is that neither the statute nor the regulations impose elaborate zoning obligations on towns. They just require, first of all, that the code include a multifamily zone, and the steps required to do that are pretty simple. If communities want to choose to do it in a different way, and a different way usually looks like adding additional policy objectives into the MBTA zone. So for example, they might wish to put it in a particular part of town. They might wish to add.
So you can add policy objectives to your MBTA zone, but be careful what kinds of policy objectives you add. As long as they go along with Governor Healy and Andrea Campbell's agenda, and the agenda of their team, the behind the scenes team, the big donors and all, then you're okay. But this is an opportunity, just like taxes are an investment, all right? We used to hear that from Oresco all the time. It's an investment. And if there's a tax increase and it's not as big as we asked for before, then it's actually a decrease in the increases, a tax cut. You see the mind games, you see the gaslighting that goes on, the cognitive dissonance that develops in the voters. But don't forget, it's people like Joe Pasevich that are causing you to lose faith in government. Let's not keep that in mind as you listen to crap like this.
Affordability requirements. They might want to avoid certain areas. Those are additional policy objectives of the town, and that's fine. The statute and the regulations allow room for those, and the regulations are largely a guide to how the municipality can include those additional policy objectives and sort of what the parameters are for including those additional policy objectives into the zoning, more so than here are a million things that you need to put in your zoning. I think as our brief highlighted and as the town concedes, there is a simple way to do this, and it doesn't cost very much money.
If we start with what you began with, it almost sounds like what you're contending is that compliance costs with this law, that anything that's associated with drafting or engineering a compliant district, it can never be a direct cost under Section 27, even if there's provable concrete costs associated with, if we're talking about Attorney Galvin mentioned with studies or consultants. Is that what you're saying?
I think I think I can answer that question with, I think I'm saying something slightly different than that, and that I can answer that with regard to the language of the statute. So the statute says, the statute to start out with only applies where there's a mandatory direct cost obligation, as Your Honor articulated earlier. And then there's an exception for incidental local administration expenses. So sometimes you can have a direct cost obligation that is also an incidental administration expense. That's not going to be covered by 27C. You might also have incidental administration expenses that are not direct cost obligations. They're still going to be exempted. So I think the question of whether there's a direct cost or not here, the real question is there a direct cost that is beyond what could be considered an incidental administration expense? And there is none here.
What's the metric?
For an incidental local administration expense. This court articulated a standard in the Worcester case. It's the only case on point. And the Worcester case, the articulation of the standard is basically that these are subordinate, relatively minor expenses that are related to management of municipal services. I'm trying to remember the exact words and not getting them, but roughly that are subordinate to a primary obligation. And I think that we meet that test. But I would also highlight that that the statutory language is another clue for us here. So the statute says 27C applies only if there's a direct cost obligation, and we're not going to include things that are in incidental administration. A key word there is incidental. Incidental is like, what is the primary obligation here? What is the statute asking you to do? The first Lexington case, which I think the parties didn't cite, we've cited the second Lexington case, which refers to the first Lexington case. But the first Lexington case, there was a direct ongoing cost obligation. Every year, year after year, the school district had to bus students to their private schools a greater distance than they had been obligated to do. There was a clear associated ongoing direct obligation cost there. And that's what 27C is designed to address. This is a situation where to get to the obligation, which is a cost-free obligation, having a zoning code that has this multifamily district, you have to take a few steps at the local level to administer, to implement that, and those are administrative steps. Did that answer your question, Justice Georges?
Kinda. Thank you.
I'm happy to clarify.
I'm still struggling with, I understand the Lexington 1 and 2, but this seems to be something very different. Back to Justice Kafker's point, where a lot of communities where there is local opposition, or this, you have to find the right place to have this district. It's not just as easy as we're going to put it here, we're going to put it there, and that's all there is to it. So having to be a little bit more, I don't know, flexible or a little bit more creative seemingly is going to be much more than just what local zoning officials just do. So I'm just kind of wondering what the limiting principle is here, because if you listen to Attorney Galvin, and even with you, the issue of you're saying it's not really a pleading issue, it's a statutory issue. But if they're saying, here's what we were spending before, like Lexington, and here's what we're spending now, and that's just more in complying with this, I'm just wondering what the limiting principle is if you started where you started, saying you got to get it done. And if you got to get it done, that's just part of the standard operating procedure.
Yes, and I think the limiting principle there is baked into the word impose. And as this court held in the Norfolk case, the word impose, that comes down to the question of what is mandatory under the statute, what is necessary under the statute, not what are all of the costs.
Basically, they want you to rethink and develop new definitions for words like impose or mandate or something like that. Unbelievable. Gaslighting, cognitive dissonance.
That were incurred in the process of coming into compliance, but rather what were the minimum mandatory costs that the statute imposed on you. There's that involuntariness. Now, again, as I think this court, the discussion earlier already acknowledged, there is voluntary and there's voluntary, but this court's precedents have been clear that even tough choices are considered voluntary for purposes of 27C.
Can I ask you began with the question of law, that we got to look at the statute and decide as a matter of law whether it imposes a mandate.
Yes.
Or all those questions we asked earlier about pleadings irrelevant, or how do we mix that into what you're pushing there?
I would say, I think that if the court, I believe this can be determined by looking at the statute, and that's what the court has done in its earlier cases, is to look at the statutes and look at what they do and determine from the statutory or regulatory language whether it's imposing a direct cost obligation exclusive of the incidental expenses. And I think the court can do that here. If the court were to say, well, let's hear what the town has to say, either in this case or in another case, then I would say that the pleading here is insufficient. And if I could just address the question of whether the incorporation of the DLM decisions in the other communities somehow cures the sort of the pleadings that are in the complaint.
Doesn't that add some life to Mr. Galvin's argument? If we're doing this as a matter of law, and as a matter of law, this imposes obligations on other towns. I mean, do we look at all the towns? I mean, you've made it harder for me, at least. So.
Well, let me, I would point the court to the language of those DLM letters in particular, because while the DLM has a very specific and narrow statutory role, and it's actually not a role that the DLM in these particular cases, including in any other MBTA community that's
They didn't
mentioned
identify
by the
what those.
It's
They
not-
didn't identify in that letter what those direct costs were.
Correct,
So
Your Honor.
They just opine without giving any examples.
Correct. There are no factual allegations to bring in from the DLM letters. And in fact, the DLM's job in an unfunded mandate case, as you can tell from the statutory language, is to calculate the amount of a deficiency. There's no calculation in any of those letters. And so there's nothing to incorporate.
Can I ask you to address the guidelines? And
Yes.
because I understood the town's argument that there are imposed costs under the guidelines for planning and maybe other things. Is that, can you just address that?
Yes, I don't think there are, and I think the guidelines which have been promulgated under 30A now, so are now regulations, guidelines, regulations, are the compliance with those guidelines is as simple as compliance with the statute. They have a few additional requirements, which is really just the submission of an application packet to the state so that the state can determine compliance. And there's nothing, and this is evident on the face of the guidelines, there's nothing that in there that is a special complicated task that a planner, and here we have the affidavit of the planner, which again, we don't think is part of the complaint. None of this is part of the complaint, but if we're getting into those affidavits, the planner has 40 plus years of experience. That's on the face of the thing. There's nothing in there. It's the submission, I'll be specific. This submission of a map showing where your zone is. There's a checklist that you enter, these are the parcels we're using, and this is all available. You download the map from the state, basically. You mark your parcels. Those parcels already, the map that you've downloaded from the state, have information in them about what their capacity is, and that automatically downloads into a chart. You fill it out. It auto-calculates the way that Excel spreadsheets somehow magically do, and I don't know how to use them, but they do this. And it tells you whether you've hit the unit capacity that you need to hit or not.
So this is complex politically, but not, this isn't like an environmental regulation where you need to hire a consultant to analyze.
Exactly.
This is just politically complicated.
Exactly. And those costs.
No, it's more than politically complicated. There are actual costs involved here: hearings, discussions, presentations, modeling, map drawing, all the other stuff that goes. And again, we don't even touch what the actual expenses to the town and the taxpayer would be if any of these projects and any portion of them got built.
Costs, again, are not imposed by the statute. They may be there, they may be real, but they're imposed by the community itself, not in a negative way, but that's where they are attributable to. Would the court like to hear argument on the second, on the town meeting voting rights argument? We believe that to the extent that's a constitutional claim, the town does not have standing to bring it. To the extent that it's a claim under Section 40A, or General Laws 40A, Section 5, we just have two statutes that don't conflict with each other, and they should be read harmoniously to give full effect to each of them.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you.
And that's kind of where we started, right there. And if you don't want to know what Section 27 is, that has to do with unfunded mandates. You can read up on it, and it says, any law taking effect imposing any direct service or cost obligation upon a city or town shall be effective in any city or town only if such law is accepted by a vote or by the appropriation of money for such purposes. That's basically unfunded mandate, someone to Corbett. What do you think of that, my friends? I'm Joe Pasevich for Control Room. I hope you enjoyed that show and you learned something about this hearing before the Supreme Judicial Court. We're not out of the woods yet by far. This fight is going to continue on. If you see me around, say hi, be careful, enjoy the warm weather. Good night, everybody.